This is not simply a story about war. It is a sprawling chronicle of a family, a testament to the fragile, almost invisible line between an ordinary life and a reality that no human mind is ever truly prepared to comprehend. It is about the quiet, mundane moments that precede a catastrophe and the heavy, suffocating silence that follows when terror transitions from a fleeting emotion to a permanent resident in your home, breathing the same air you do. In a small Ukrainian town, where the springs always smelled of blooming apricot trees and the autumns carried the nostalgic scent of burning leaves, lived a young girl named Irina. She was the kind of child who observed the world rather than just moving through it. She noticed the microscopic details that adults often ignored, the way the afternoon sun danced across the faded floral wallpaper in the living room, revealing millions of swirling dust motes, the comforting, rhythmic creak of the wooden stairs under her father's weight, and the subtle, almost imperceptible shift in her mother's voice when the exhaustion of a long day finally caught up with her. Irina loved the simple, predictable rhythms of her life. She loved the mornings anchored by sweet black tea and thick slices of bread with homemade jam, the days filled with the loud echoes of school corridors and chalk dust, and the evenings at home where the world felt unshakable, safe, and entirely hers. Her mother, Irina, was a woman who radiated a quiet, enduring warmth. She was the absolute center of their household, the gravitational force that held everything together. Even when times were tough, her hands always seemed to smell of vanilla, fresh dough, and laundry soap. She had a way of folding clothes, of setting the table, of humming softly under her breath, that made the house feel completely insulated from the world's harshness. Her father, Igor, was cut from an entirely different cloth. He was a man of few words, stoic, tall, and reserved. He never wasted breath on idle chatter, but when he did speak, his words carried the solid weight of absolute reliability. He was a man of action. He fixed what was broken, found exits when doors seemed locked, and held a quiet, unshakable conviction that any problem could be dismantled and solved if approached with a cool, rational mind. His hands were calloused, always marked with a faint trace of motor oil or sawdust. Just a few streets away lived their relatives, Anatoly and Marina. They were more than extended family. They were the vibrant, noisy fabric of Irina's daily existence. There were Sunday dinners that stretched for hours, shared holidays filled with laughter, and long meandering conversations in the kitchen that stretched late into the night. They argued passionately about the weather, complained about rising prices at the market, planned summer trips to the sea, and dissected minor workplace dramas with the seriousness of politicians. None of them could have imagined that very soon these ordinary worries would feel like distant echoes from an entirely different universe, a luxury they would give anything to have back. The morning it all began offered no omens. The sky was clear, painted in the pale, icy, unforgiving blue of late winter. There were no warnings etched in the clouds, no sudden atmospheric shifts, no flocks of birds flying in the wrong direction, only the familiar, comforting hush of the early hours. Irina sat at the kitchen table, her feet dangling above the linoleum floor, slowly sipping her tea. She was mesmerized by the steam rising from her mug, tracing the chaotic, ghostly shapes it drew in the chilly morning air. She felt no desire to rush. There was nowhere else she needed to be. The kitchen clock ticked rhythmically on the wall, a heartbeat of normalcy. "Mom, do I really have to go to school today?" she asked. It was a ritualistic question, asked not with the hope of a true reprieve, but because it belonged to the morning routine, a script they played out every Tuesday. Irina offered a faint, tired smile, her eyes focused on slicing a loaf of bread, the knife making a soft, scraping sound against the wooden board. "Yes, of course, Irina. Life doesn't stop." Life doesn't stop. The words hung in the warm kitchen air, simple, certain, and seemingly invincible. And then came the sound. At first, it was distant, a deep, guttural thud that seemed to roll across the horizon. It wasn't overwhelmingly loud, but it possessed a terrifying physical weight, a violent vibration that traveled through the concrete foundation of the house, up through the floorboards, and resonated somewhere deep beneath their ribs. It was a sound that simply did not belong in their world. It shattered the rhythm of the morning completely. Igor froze mid-step, his hand hovering over the back of a wooden chair. He tilted his head slightly, his eyes losing focus on the room as he listened to the air outside. His expression shifted for only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to turn the temperature in the room freezing cold. "That wasn't thunder," he said. His voice was low, stripped of any panic, but laced with a grim, absolute certainty that made the hairs on Irina's arms stand up. Seconds later, a second explosion tore through the distance. This one was catastrophically closer. The glass in the kitchen windows rattled violently in their frames, emitting a sharp, angry buzz. The air pressure in the room seemed to suddenly compress, popping their ears, as if an invisible, suffocating weight had just been dropped upon the roof of the house. Irina felt it before her brain could process it. A sudden, primal spike of adrenaline, a terror that required no vocabulary to understand. The tea sloshed over the rim of her mug, burning her fingers, but she didn't even feel the heat. Outside, the world began to dismantle itself faster than the human mind could comprehend. News trickled in through fragmented texts and chaotic social media feeds. The words flashing across their phone screens were surreal, disconnected from the reality of their quiet street. Invasion, columns, border breached, martial law. The mind fiercely resisted absorbing them. It was a defense mechanism, a desperate attempt to reject the nightmare unfolding in real time. By the afternoon of the second day, the fog of confusion lifted, replaced by a terrifying, razor-sharp clarity. The streets, usually bustling with neighbors walking dogs and children riding bicycles, were completely abandoned. Cars were left parked at odd angles on the curbs, some with their doors still hanging open, as if the drivers had evaporated into thin air in the middle of a panic. Shop owners had hastily taped their windows in frantic crisscross patterns before fleeing. Then, the invisible threads that connected them to the outside world snapped. Cell towers went dark. Messages failed to send, the little circles spinning endlessly on glass screens. Calls dropped into a void of dead air. The feeling of isolation crashed over them like a tidal wave. They were trapped on an island of their own home, surrounded by an ocean of incoming violence. That evening, Anatoly and Marina arrived. They didn't knock. They burst through the door, chest-heaving, wide-eyed, bringing the smell of cold sweat and panic into the hallway. The way they entered communicated everything before a single word was spoken. "They're here," Anatoly gasped, bracing his hands on his knees, struggling to pull air into his lungs. He didn't need to specify who they were. Military vehicles, armor. They're on the main avenue. They're shooting at civilian cars. Marina stood rigidly behind him, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Her eyes were brimming with tears she fiercely refused to shed, her jaw locked in terror. "What do we do?" she whispered, the question barely escaping her throat, fragile as glass. The question floated in the silent living room, heavy and unanswered. Not because Igor and Ina were ignoring her, but because there was no answer to give. That night, they dragged mattresses into the windowless hallway, deciding that keeping the family together in the center of the house was the only fragile armor they had left. By the third day, the house above ground had become a death trap. The walls that had protected them for years suddenly felt as thin as paper against the artillery that now constantly shook the earth. The basement became their new, terrifying world. Initially, they treated it as a temporary inconvenience, a place to wait out the storm for a few days until politicians negotiated or armies sorted things out. They carried down old, scratchy wool blankets, thin camping mats, large plastic jugs filled with tap water, whatever canned food and pickled vegetables they could raid from the pantry, cheap plastic flashlights, and a battery-powered radio coated in years of garage dust. The basement was never meant to sustain human life. It was a root cellar and a storage space. It smelled of damp, suffocating earth, rotting potatoes, and old dust. The air was heavy, stagnant, and bitingly cold, chilling them to the bone. The ceiling was low, intersected by wooden joists and rusted pipes, forcing the adults to hunch over uncomfortably. But it was beneath the earth. The thick layers of soil and the concrete foundation provided the only psychological shield they had against the mechanical, roaring hell tearing their town apart above. Irina claimed a corner behind a stack of empty jars, wrapping herself tightly in a plaid blanket, refusing to leave her mother's side for even a second. She became acutely tuned to the acoustics of war, trying to decode the chaos above. She learned to differentiate the sounds. The high-pitched, tearing shriek of jets tearing the sky open, the incoming whistle of artillery that made you hold your breath, and the bone-rattling thuds that sent showers of plaster dust falling from the wooden ceiling joists into their hair and eyes. "Mom," Irina whispered during a particularly violent barrage that made the concrete floor beneath them literally sway. Her voice was a fragile, trembling thread in the darkness. "Are we going to die down here?" Irina closed her eyes. For a mother, that single second of hesitation felt like a lifetime of agonizing failure. When she opened them, her gaze was fierce, maternal, and uncompromising. She pulled Irina tightly against her chest, rocking her slowly. "No," Irina said. Her voice was as solid as iron, betraying none of the terror tearing her apart inside. "We are going to survive. Do you hear me? We are going to survive." She had no idea if it was a lie, but in that subterranean darkness, that lie was the only oxygen they had to breathe. Days dissolved into a continuous, indistinguishable blur. Down there, the sun did not rise, and the moon did not set. Time was no longer measured by clocks or the shifting of light, but by the excruciating pauses between bombardments. The silence was often worse than the explosions. The noise meant the danger was happening somewhere out there. The silence meant the danger was stalking them, creeping closer while they waited, paralyzed. Soon, new sounds joined the distant cacophony, much closer, much more intimate. The heavy, synchronized crunch of combat boots on the asphalt right outside their basement vents. Shouts in a harsh, foreign language that wasn't theirs. The deep, vibrating, mechanical growl of diesel engines from armored vehicles crawling slowly down their narrow residential street, hunting. Their fear evolved. It stopped being a sharp, adrenaline-fueled panic and settled into a chronic, exhausting physical ache. They stopped speaking in normal voices entirely, communicating only in breathless, lip-reading whispers. Every movement was calculated to avoid making a sound. A cough cleared was a danger. A dropped spoon was a catastrophe. Irina aged years in a matter of days. She stopped asking questions about when they could go back upstairs, about school, about her friends. She simply watched the adults with wide, dark eyes, absorbing their tension like a sponge. She learned to sleep through the distant shelling, but would wake instantly at the sound of a vehicle approaching on their street. Irina held the fragile ecosystem together through sheer willpower. She rationed the food with agonizing, mathematical precision. She whispered long, intricate fairy tales to Irina to distract her from the trembling earth and continuously smoothed her daughter's dust-filled hair. But at night, when the only light was the dying ember of a single flashlight and everyone was trapped in a fitful, nightmare-laced sleep, Irina would turn her face to the damp concrete wall and weep without making a single sound, her shoulders shaking violently in the dark. The breaking point arrived on the 7th day, a day that felt no different from the rest until the afternoon. The rumbling of the tanks had faded down the street, but it was replaced by something infinitely more terrifying, the distinct, shattering crash of glass directly above them. Someone had smashed the large kitchen window. In the basement, 5 people stopped breathing simultaneously. Igor moved with lethal, predatory silence. He reached out and wrapped his large, calloused hand around the wooden handle of an old, rusted axe they kept for chopping firewood, pulling it into his lap. Irina clamped both hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror so pure it looked like absolute madness. Anatoly backed into a corner, his fists clenched. Inna pressed Irina's face deep into her chest, covering the girl's ears with her hands, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. Heavy, deliberate, weighted footsteps echoed across the living room floorboards. Strangers were walking through their home. They could hear the sickening sound of furniture being overturned, heavy cabinets being ripped open and their contents dumped, glass plates shattering against the kitchen tiles. The intruders were searching for valuables, for food, for people. The footsteps moved deliberately toward the hallway, toward the wooden door leading to the basement stairs. The floorboards creaked violently under the immense weight of the combat boots. Fine, gray dust sifted through the floorboards, landing gently on Irina's face. She didn't blink. She didn't breathe. The brass doorknob of the basement door rattled aggressively. Igor had barricaded it from the inside on the very first day with a heavy iron crowbar jammed beneath the handle and bolted into the wooden frame. The door shuddered violently under the assault, but it held fast. A voice barked a harsh command in Russian, followed by a cruel, dismissive laugh. A heavy boot kicked the door, a massive, deafening bang that echoed down the stairwell like a gunshot. In the basement, hearts hammered against rib cages so violently that Irina was sure the soldiers could hear the rhythmic thumping through the floorboards. Igor's knuckles were white around the axe handle. He positioned himself at the bottom of the stairs, ready to swing at the first thing that came through the splintered wood. Seconds stretched, warped, and twisted into an agonizing eternity. The door did not give way. There was some more muffled shouting, the sound of a vase smashing against the wall, and then the footsteps slowly retreated down the hall. The front door slammed shut, vibrating the walls. They were gone. No one in the basement moved a muscle or spoke a single word for 3 entire hours. They sat in the pitch black, listening to their own ragged breathing. The crisis of starvation did not announce itself with fanfare. It crept in slowly, day by day, before suddenly becoming a fatal emergency. In the beginning, they had eaten regular meals, fueled by the delusion of a quick resolution. But by the 10th day, the plastic bags were empty. The jars of preserves were scraped clean. The rationing became draconian, then desperate. A single piece of hard, stale bread was divided into 5 microscopic slivers. A spoonful of cold beans was meant to last 12 hours. Water was doled out in tiny, measured sips, just barely enough to wet a parched throat and keep the kidneys functioning. Hunger became a physical entity in the room, gnawing at their stomachs, making their heads light and their limbs impossibly heavy. "We have enough for 3 days," Igor stated flatly one evening, staring at the bottom of a plastic bin under the beam of a fading flashlight. "4, if we stop eating altogether and only drink water." Irina broke down, sliding down the wall until she hit the floor, burying her face in her hands. "We are going to die in this hole," she sobbed, all her defenses finally shattered. "We are going to slowly die down here like rats." No one offered a counter-argument. The truth was too heavy in the room. The air that night felt thicker, suffocatingly tight. Igor sat in the darkest corner of the cellar, staring at the barricaded door at the top of the stairs for a long time. Slowly, with great effort, he stood up and zipped his dust-covered winter jacket to his chin. "I have to go out," he said into the darkness. Inna lunged forward, grabbing his sleeve with a desperate, white-knuckled grip. "No. Igor, no. It's suicide. There are patrols everywhere, snipers on the rooftops. You saw what happened to the neighbor's house. If I don't go out there, we starve to death in 3 days. If we run out of water, we die in 2, he replied. His voice was completely devoid of emotion. the voice of a man who had already accepted the brutal mathematics of survival and made his peace with the odds. "I can't sit here and watch Irina waste away." The room fell dead silent. The reality of his words crushed them. Irina looked at her father. The innocent, sparkling spark in her eyes had been replaced by a grim, hollow, adult understanding of mortality. She understood he might never walk back down those stairs. "Daddy, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Come back." He walked over, knelt down, and kissed her forehead. He tasted the dust on her skin. He nodded once to Ina, turned, removed the crowbar with agonizing slowness, and climbed the stairs into the darkness of their ruined home. When the basement door closed quietly behind him, a vacuum formed in the room. The space felt horrifyingly empty, as if the oxygen had left with him. Above ground, the city was a graveyard. The moon cast long, eerie, silver shadows over the pulverized remains of familiar houses. The air was thick with the acrid, chemical stench of burning rubber, pulverized brick, and raw cordite. Igor moved like a ghost, darting between the burnt, twisted husks of cars and crawling through destroyed garden fences. The neighborhood he had known his entire life was unrecognizable. A child's swing set was twisted into a grotesque metal sculpture. A neighbor's floral curtain blew out of a shattered window like a surrender flag. Every snapped twig underfoot, every shift of rubble beneath his boots, sounded like a deafening gunshot to his hyper-vigilant ears. He raided abandoned, half-collapsed cellars, digging frantically through the debris of his neighbors' ruined homes in the dark. At one point, as he was prying open a jammed pantry door, he heard the low, guttural murmur of voices. A foot patrol. Igor threw himself backward into the freezing mud, scrambling underneath the chassis of a flipped delivery van. He pressed his face flat into the cold, wet earth, closing his eyes, holding his breath until his lungs burned and spots danced in his vision. The soldiers walked past slowly, their heavy boots splashing in the puddles, missing his head by mere inches. He could smell their cigarette smoke. He waited a full 20 minutes after their voices faded into the wind before he dared to exhale and pull himself out of the mud. Back in the basement, the waiting was a profound form of psychological torture. Every minute felt like an hour. Marina rocked back and forth, clutching her knees. Anatoly paced the agonizingly short distance from one concrete wall to the other, muttering to himself. Irina sat cross-legged on her mat, staring at the wooden door at the top of the stairs, trying to use the sheer, desperate force of her will to make it open, to make him appear. Hours passed. The flashlight battery died completely, plunging them into absolute, impenetrable darkness. Then, a faint sound. The soft, careful scraping of metal against wood. The hinges groaned, crying out in the quiet. The door cracked open, letting in a sliver of gray ambient light from upstairs. Igor stumbled down the wooden steps, his breathing heavy and ragged. He was covered from head to toe in gray soot and wet mud. His jacket was torn at the shoulder, and a jagged cut was bleeding freely down his cheek, dripping onto his collar. But he was breathing. He was standing. In his hands, gripped tightly, were two heavy plastic bags. Inside were 5 dented cans of beans, a glass jar of pickled tomatoes, a crushed box of sweet crackers, and, most incredibly, most miraculously, 2 large sealed plastic bottles of purified water. Irina scrambled up in the dark, tripping over the blankets, and threw her thin arms around his waist. Igor dropped the bags, fell to his knees on the hard concrete floor, and buried his dirty, bleeding face in his daughter's neck. His broad shoulders shook violently, silently, as he finally let the terror out. 2 days later, the dynamic of the war shifted again. The old battery-powered radio, which had done nothing but emit a maddening hiss of white noise for 2 straight weeks, suddenly crackled to life. It caught a fragmented, wavering signal. Through the heavy static they heard a Ukrainian news anchor's voice, calm and resolute. They huddled around the tiny plastic speaker, holding their breath, pressing their ears close. They could only catch isolated, broken words. Counter-offensive, pushed back, heavy losses, liberated. They hung on to those broken syllables like lifelines thrown into a raging sea. And then it happened. The war sounds stopped entirely. There were no more explosions shaking the dust from the ceiling, no heavy boots marching aggressively above them, no diesel engines growling ominously in the streets, no gunfire echoing in the distance. There was only silence. But this silence did not feel like a predator waiting in the dark to strike. It felt hollow. It felt clear. It felt light. For the first time in 16 days, they could hear the wind rustling through the bare branches of the great oak tree in their front yard. They waited for 6 agonizing hours, paralyzed by the ingrained fear that it was a trap, a lull before a final, devastating storm. No one dared to move. Finally, Igor stood up, his joints popping. He reached for the crowbar. "We need to look. We need to know." They climbed the wooden stairs behind him. Their legs felt weak, their muscles atrophied from the confinement and lack of food. Igor slowly pushed the front door open, the hinges screaming in the quiet air. The morning sunlight hit them like a physical blow, blinding them instantly. They raised their pale, trembling hands to shield their faces, squinting against the brilliance. As their eyes slowly adjusted to the light, they looked out at their town. It was broken. Roofs were completely caved in, asphalt was heavily cratered from mortar shells, and the blackened, smoking husks of military vehicles littered the intersections. Power lines lay tangled in the streets like dead snakes. But there were no soldiers. The occupiers were gone. The streets belonged to the silence and to them. Irina took a timid, shaking step out onto the concrete front porch. The cold air rushed into her lungs. It tasted sharply of ash, copper, and dust, but it was fresh, moving air. She tilted her head back, closing her eyes for a moment, feeling the warmth of the sun on her filthy face. Then she opened her eyes and looked up at the sky. It was exactly the same infinite, pale, unforgiving blue sky that had been there on the morning she drank her tea, before the world ended. Unbothered, unbroken, indifferent to their suffering, yet beautiful in its constancy. For the first time in 16 endless, terrifying days in the dark, the muscles in her face twitched, pulled upwards, and Irina smiled. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was real. They were battered, deeply traumatized, starving and standing in the absolute ruins of their old life. Everything they knew had been violently altered. But as Igor wrapped his arm around Ina, and Anatoly and Marina stepped out onto the grass, breathing deeply, they realized the only truth that mattered. They were breathing. They were standing together on their own earth, under their own sun. And in that transcendent, quiet moment, after surviving the absolute darkest depths of human terror, that single fact alone was enough to rebuild a world upon. Life, despite everything, had not stopped.